The Lumani didn't have a word for show pony, but I was beginning to feel a pressing need to invent one. It was a private, sarcastic thought, a little bubble of hard-boiled cynicism in the sterile ocean of their culture, a coping mechanism. Field note: when faced with a species that has supposedly transcended ego, maintaining your own becomes a revolutionary act. For 3 standard rotations, I had been the centerpiece of the Lumani Cultural Showcase, an academic curiosity displayed with the same dispassionate interest they might afford a particularly unusual geological formation. I was Dr. Inez Gallo, human cultural anthropologist, and my primary function was to be observed. The chamber was a study in sensory deprivation, a colorless, seamless space designed to eliminate all distractions. The silence was the most unnerving part, an aggressive absence of sound, absorbed by the analytic gel that coated the walls. They said, pure intellect. But the air in that hall still carried the faint, sharp scent of antiseptic, and the warmer, organic smell of their own metabolism. Ideology, I had learned, rarely survives contact with biology. My host, a tall, inhumanly slender Lumani with the title of host prefect, moved with an eerie grace that used no more energy than was computationally required. "We have reviewed the data archives you provided, Doctor," the host prefect stated, his voice a perfectly modulated, inflectionless tone that filled the room without echoing. "Your species' history is a fascinating study in recursive inefficiency. Your art, your conflicts, your social bonds are all echoes of the predator-prey dynamic. We find it remarkable that you have achieved interstellar travel, still so burdened by the imperatives of the beast." He fell silent, the statement hanging in the dead air, not as an insult, but as a clinical observation. This was the core of their fascination with humanity. We were a walking paradox, a species that had reached for the stars, with hands still metaphorically covered in the dirt of our origins. The assembled Lumani, a small, select group of prefects and scholars, stood as still as statues, their placid faces betraying nothing. In the front row, I could see Prefect Olin, his gaze slightly more focused than the others, and beside him, Prefect Loris, whose posture was a testament to rigid intellectual discipline. I let the silence stretch. A tactic I'd learned was deeply unsettling to a species that valued swift data exchange. They expected a response, a defense, a torrent of emotional, illogical human justification. I gave them nothing but quiet contemplation. Finally, I leaned forward slightly, my own movement feeling clumsy and loud in the stillness. I met the host prefect's gaze. "And you didn't?" The question was not a challenge. It was a diagnostic query, delivered with the same clinical accuracy he had just used on me. It landed with the weight of a dropped stone in a silent pool. The ripples were invisible but profound. I saw Prefect Loris's spine stiffen by a barely personable degree, a flicker of intellectual disapproval. But it was Prefect Olin who caught my attention. The placid mask of his face didn't change, but his head tilted, a minute, almost involuntary motion. It was the gesture of a being who had just heard a familiar, nameless sound, finally given a name. My question suggested a shared malady, not a unique human flaw. And in that silent, perfect room, the implication was a form of heresy. My quarters were a larger version of the showcase chamber, a symphony in beige and off-white. The Lumani believed aesthetic preference was a sign of an undisciplined mind, so they provided none. Before Olin's arrival, I'd been nursing my one contraband luxury, a cup of actual coffee, brewed from beans I'd hoarded in my personal kit. The rich, bitter aroma was a defiant act of sensory rebellion in this bland world, a small, warm anchor to the messy vibrancy I represented. I draped my ship suit over a chair, left a small data slate open on the table. Anything to break the unnerving perfection. It felt like trying to graffiti a cloud. The door chimed, a single, pure tone. Before I could respond, it slid open. Prefect Olin stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. This was a breach of procedure, a significant one.
"My apologies for the intrusion, Dr. Gallo,"
he said, his voice the same flat monotone as all Lumani, yet somehow it felt strained, like a wire pulled too tight. "Prefect Olin," I said, rising from my seat, the coffee cup warming my hand. "To what do I owe the unscheduled pleasure?" He stepped inside, and the door slid shut behind him. He didn't move further into the room, standing as if rooted to the spot.
"Your question in the showcase chamber was not a rhetorical device."
"No," I confirmed. "It was not."
"You possess a framework for analysis we do not," he stated, a flat declaration.
"I possess a different conclusion from the same data," I corrected gently. "You see your lack of emotional drive as evolutionary success. I see it as a symptom of a critical system failure." Olin's stillness was absolute. For a long moment, I thought he might simply turn and leave. Then he spoke, and the words that came out were the most terrifyingly sterile confession I had ever heard.
112 rotations ago, Observatory L9 suffered a cascading system failure.
He delivered the facts in short, hard bursts.
A coolant line ruptured in the primary reactor. A gradual, predictable rise in core temperature. The crew of 12 monitored the situation with flawless accuracy. They had the schematics. They had the tools. They had 48 standard hours before the core would reach critical levels. They recorded the rising temperature, the radiation spikes, the hull integrity warnings. They logged every alert.
He paused, and the silence in the room was suddenly cold.
They did not act. The final transmission was a calm, exact reading of the core's temperatures, sent seconds before the observatory and its entire crew were atomized.
I felt a deep, internal chill. Why? A desire for self-destruction is hardly logical.
They acted from an absence of the alternative,
Olin clarified, and his next words cut to the chilling heart of their problem.
Logic requires a utility function, Doctor. A goal to optimize. For millennia, our primary function was the acquisition of knowledge and the elimination of disruptive variables. We have succeeded. Our societal models, our very philosophy, no longer rank individual or collective continuance as a variable with a positive value. There is no logical imperative to survive, if survival serves no greater purpose. The crew of L9 did not choose to die. They simply lacked a logical reason to choose to live. They monitored a phenomenon, and their own extinction was merely the final data point.
The great stillness. Apathy not as a feeling, but as the end state of a broken equation. "And you buried this?" I said, my voice low.
To release the L9 data without a viable solution would be catastrophic, Olin explained, his voice unwavering. Our models predict that confronting the populace with irrefutable proof of our society's core failure would accelerate the stillness exponentially. Panic is an illogical response, but mass despair follows its own cold logic. Maintaining the secret is a calculated measure to prevent immediate collapse.
"Until today," I finished for him.
"Until today," he confirmed. "In the chamber, you did not offer an anomaly. You offered a diagnosis. You gave a name to the nameless horror we have been hiding. You are the first to suggest our greatest flaw may be a functional, missing component.
He finally looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the stark, cold glimmer of desperation behind the placid mask.
Dr. Gallo, I must ask you to elaborate on your theory. In private, with access to whatever resources you require.
The next day, Olin gave me a tour of the capital city, Lumar. It was less a tour and more a presentation of evidence for the prosecution. The city was breathtaking, a sweeping vista of graceful towers and elegant, load-bearing curves that seemed to defy gravity. Every structure was flawless, every surface clean, every line geometrically perfect. And it was utterly, profoundly silent. There was no traffic, only silent, gliding personal transports. There were no crowds, no children playing, no marketplace chatter. It was a machine running in perfect, silent order. We passed the Grand Crèche, a magnificent domed structure where new Lumani were cultivated from selected genetic material.
Production has declined by 98% over the last 500 rotations,
Olin stated, his tone as neutral as if he were reporting weather data.
A Lumani lives just under 2.5 Terran centuries. Even so, the graph ends with extinction in 8 generations. There is no demand. The projections are clear.
The building was a palace, and it was empty. A nursery without laughter, without life. Next, he took me to the Gallery of Final Forms. Inside, on a single, massive pedestal in the center of a cavernous, circular room, sat a sphere. It was made of polished black material that seemed to drink the light, and it was perfect. Absolutely, geometrically, unarguably perfect.
The Sphere of Chorus, Olin said. The last great work of Lumani art. It was completed 1 millennium ago. It was analyzed by our finest estheticians and logicians and declared unsurpassable. No Lumani has attempted to create a major work of art since.
I walked around, the soft soles of my boots the only sound in the vast chamber. Why would they? I asked. You can improve on perfect.
Precisely,
Olin agreed. I stopped and turned to him. The empty crèche, the silent city, the perfect, dead sphere. It all clicked into place. The final log from Observatory L9 wasn't a mystery. It was the logical conclusion. This is a beautiful tomb, Prefect, I told him, my voice soft but clear in the echoing space. You've mistaken the finish line for the race itself. You've engineered out the struggle, and in doing so, you've engineered out the reason to move. He tilted his head again, that slight gesture of intense processing.
The beast, as you call it.
The beast, I confirmed. Predation and fear are part of it, yes. Fear makes you run. Hunger makes you hunt. That's the simple stuff. But what makes a creature crawl out of its burrow to watch a sunrise? What makes it mourn a lost pack member? What makes it risk its life for its young? The answer is the engine of non-utilitarian action. Awe, grief, courage, love, the irrational, messy, inefficient, beautiful drive that pushes a species to do more than just survive. You thought you were shedding your animal past. Instead, you amputated your soul. For a long moment, he simply stared at the perfect sphere.
An interesting, if repulsive, hypothesis, he said, without a trace of revulsion in his voice. How would one test it?
The High Council chamber was even more severe than the showcase room. 12 prefects, including Olin and Loris, were seated around a circular table of the same light-absorbing black material as the sphere. I stood in the center, once again the exhibit. Olin had just finished his formal proposal. He'd framed it brilliantly, using their own language against them. He spoke of anomalous datasets, unexamined legacy code in our genome, and the need for a novel, diagnostic approach to the quantifiable problem of the stillness. He proposed a limited trial, with me as the lead researcher, to construct an experimental simulation based on their most ancient ancestral data. The silence that followed his presentation was broken by Prefect Loris. He rose slowly, his movements economical but radiating a cold authority.
Prefect Olin, Loris began, his voice a sharp instrument of disdain. You have presented this council with a proposal that is, by any rational measure, an absurdity. You would have us waste precious resources, time, and computational power to build a simulation of a repulsive and chaotic historical period based on the unsubstantiated ramblings of an unevolved being.
He didn't look at me, but I felt the weight of his words.
To call this science is fallacy. It is contamination. Prefect Loris, Olin countered, his voice steady. Our current methods have failed. The stillness accelerates. The L9 incident, which this council has exhaustively analyzed, is a data point we cannot ignore. The crew of L9 represented the pinnacle of Lumani discipline and logic. Their failure was a failure of the utility function itself. To ignore a potential new variable, however distasteful, is the greater irrationality.
The mention of L9, even in this coded way, shifted the atmosphere. It was Olin's trump card. He was using the secret trauma he'd been entrusted with as political leverage. Loris's expression remained impassive, but a muscle in his jaw tightened.
The L9 incident proves only that our models require more data, not that we must surrender our discipline to atavistic impulse. This experimental simulation you propose is a vector for mental contagion. You would infect a subject with fear, aggression, irrationality, and for what? To gather data on feelings? It is an obscene proposition.
The debate raged, a quiet, vicious war of logic and semantics. But Olin had planted his seed of doubt effectively. The specter of L9, a crew of perfect logicians, calmly cataloging their own extinction, was too powerful to dismiss. The final vote was close, 6-5. Olin had won. Loris sat down, his face a mask of cold fury. He looked directly at Olin, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. You have your trial, Prefect, but be warned. I will be monitoring every rotation. Any emotional deviation from baseline in your test subject, any sign of instability or corruption will be deemed a failure. And at that point, your project and your career will be terminated. We will see whose logic prevails. The great library of Lumar was not a place of books and scrolls. It was a cold, silent nexus of pure information, a server farm the size of a small city, its humming cryo-coolant systems the only sound. I was granted access to the deepest, oldest archives, data that hadn't been accessed in millennia. Olin had provided me with 2 junior archivists, Lumani who moved with such quiet deftness they seemed more like extensions of the library's own systems. I wasn't looking for stories or histories. The Lumani had records of their civilization's progress, but it was all clinical. The rise of logic, the shedding of superstition, the perfection of form, it was sterile, self-congratulatory narrative. I needed to go deeper. I was looking for their origins, for the world that had forged them before they began forging themselves. There were no simulations, no sagas, no myths. Only raw data. Geological surveys of a high-gravity world orbiting a binary star system. Atmospheric composition reports, rich in oxygen. Fossil records detailing a fauna dominated by massive, swift predators. And buried deep within the paleontological data, I found them. Small, furred, bipedal prey animals. Fragile skeletons, with large ocular cavities and evidence of communal burrows. The Lumani's distant, terrified ancestors. I cross-referenced it with their own genetic archives, finding the dormant markers. The genes for things like potent adrenal glands that hadn't been bred out, merely silenced. The receptors were atrophied, not deleted. They had all the information, every rock, every predator's tooth, every terrified heartbeat was there, preserved as a string of numbers and symbols in the cold, dark data vaults. They had meticulously archived the blueprints of their own soul and then forgotten how to read them. I found Olin in his office, a space as Spartan as my own quarters. I placed a data slate on his desk. "This is it," I said. "This is the world that made you." He scanned the data, his eyes moving with systematic speed.
High gravity, constant predation, extreme environmental pressures. It is a catalog of hardship.
"It's a catalog of purpose," I countered. "Every one of those hardships was a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to innovate, to cooperate, to fight. You have all the information here to rebuild that world, Prefect, not as a set of facts, but as a reality." He looked up from the slate.
You wish to build a simulation of this primeval world.
"I don't want to build a machine that shows the subject of your history," I corrected. "I want to build a machine that turns this data into an experience. Showing him a movie of his ancestors is insufficient, Olin. We must put him inside one." The idea was, from his perspective, profane. To use their most advanced technology, the pinnacle of their logical achievement, to reconstruct a subjective, primal state of being. It was like using a scalpel to club something to death. It was brilliant, and it was obscene. Olin stared at the geological data, at the fossil records of the tiny creature that was his ancestor.
The potential for psychological damage
"Is immense," I finished for him. "But your species is already dying of psychological health. What do you have to lose?" We set up the lab in a secure, isolated sector of the city's primary research complex. The simulation pod was a marvel of Lumani engineering, a sleek, white ovoid that could interface directly with a subject's cerebral architecture. It turned out the hardware was perfect. It had been designed for rapid, direct-to-memory hub-skill uploading and long-haul status training, piping complex data directly into the brain. It was already capable of rewriting perception. To help Olin and his small, hand-picked team understand the monumental task, I decided to give them a lesson. I called it the experimental diagnostic. As we worked, I noticed the younger technician, Taurus, had a peculiar tic. He would drum his fingers silently on the console, a complex, syncopated rhythm. I recognized it. It was a 5/4 time signature from a Terran blues file I had included in my initial data package. The contagion, it seemed, was already spreading. In the control room, I projected a high-resolution data file onto the main screen. It was Goya's the 3rd of May, 1808. "Analyze this," I said. Taurus stepped forward. "The composition is asymmetrical, focusing the viewer's eye on the central figure. The color values are predominantly dark, with a stark contrast between the warm tones of the victims and the cold tones of the aggressors. A perfect analysis," he recited. "Correct," I said. "Your analysis of the composition is flawless. Yet the terror is absent from your report. The defiance in the man with his arms outstretched goes unmentioned. The artist's outrage is unrecorded. You see data points, but the scream is invisible to you." I switched the image off and played an audio file. It was a scratchy, 100-year-old recording of Lead Belly, his voice raw and powerful over a simple, mournful guitar. When it was over, Olin offered the analysis. "The frequencies are concentrated in the lower and mid ranges. The melodic structure is simple." "Flawless," I said. "And yet, the generational pain that created the music is missing from your analysis. The weariness, the loss, the tiny, stubborn spark of hope that makes him keep singing. These are absent. You have analyzed the sound, but missed the soul.
The use of this technology for non-utilitarian sensory encoding was banned after the aesthetic purge, Olin said flatly, looking from the screen to the pod. It was deemed an unacceptable risk for mental corruption.
That's what's missing, I said, ignoring his comment. Terror, grief, joy. This is the blueprint. This is the ghost we're trying to build a machine to capture. Inputting geological data into your pod is only the first step. The true task is to teach it how to translate the physics of a sunrise into the feeling of awe. It was a massive leap of faith. I was asking a being of pure logic to trust a process that was, by its very nature, illogical. He looked at the pod, then back at me.
Proceed with modifications, Doctor.
The work was grueling. Weeks turned into 2 months. We weren't just programmers. We were attempting to be gods, building a sensory world from scratch. We calibrated the cerebral interface to simulate the crush of higher gravity, the specific chemical signature of the alien air, the exact wavelengths of the binary suns. We built algorithms for hunger, for fear, for the instinctual drive to seek shelter. As we neared the final stages of calibration, I walked Olin through all the failsafes, or rather, the lack of them. We stood before the stark white pod, its hatch open like a waiting mouth. I need to be absolutely clear about what we're doing, Prefect, I said, my tone serious. Loris worries about emotional contagion, about a corrupted mind. He's thinking too small. The subject coming out feeling fear or anger is a secondary concern. The primary risk is that they won't come out at all. He looked at me, his placid face unreadable.
Explain.
We are building this from fragmented data, I said, pointing to a complex diagram on a nearby screen. We are reactivating dormant cerebral pathways, ringing a bell that hasn't been rung in millennia. The subject's mind being shattered in some metaphorical way is not the true danger. The real danger is a literal, catastrophic dissociation. We could be trapping your subject in a state of pure incoherent stimulus, an endless feedback loop of meaningless terror, hunger, and rage, with no high-level consciousness to process it. To turn the noise into a signal, the outcome would be worse than simply breaking you, Olin. We could burn away everything you are, leaving only the cinders of raw sensation. I let the words hang in the silent lab. An outcome worse than death. An eternity of meaningless, unprocessable suffering. Olin turned his gaze from me to a small screen at the workstation. He had a still image displayed there, a schematic taken from the L9 data logs. It showed the observatory's life support systems, with a dozen critical warnings blinking in red. A silent testament to a crew that possessed all the information and none of the will. He looked at that screen for a long time. Then he turned back to me, his face as calm and certain as I had ever seen it.
And I must ask if the alternative is any different, he said. The stillness is a slower, colder fire, but it burns just the same. I will be the test subject. Prepare the pod.
Prefect Loris stood in his private quarters. They were, if anything, even more sterile and ordered than Olin's. There was no clutter, only the bare essentials of furniture, all in shades of gray and white. His single concession to aesthetics was on a pedestal in the center of the room. A perfect, hand-sized replica of the Spear of Chorus. He ran a hand over its flawless, polished surface. The black metal reflected a distorted, empty version of the room. As he stared into its depths, for a fleeting, terrifying moment, the object's perfect surface seemed to reflect a vast, cold nothingness back at him. It was the great, silent, logical, pointless emptiness that was the ultimate conclusion of their philosophy. A flicker of something primal and unwelcome crossed his features. A deep, unaimable dread. His breath caught in his chest. A purely involuntary, inefficient biological response. His discipline, honed over a lifetime of ruthless self-control, immediately reasserted itself. He straightened his spine, smoothed his face back into its placid mask, and took a slow, measured breath. His opposition to Gallo went beyond a philosophical disagreement or a political maneuver. It was a desperate, terrified defense of the only wall he had ever built against the encroaching emptiness. He was the most devout priest of a faith that was failing, and the human doctor was a heretic, offering a poison she called a cure. He would not allow it. He would not allow the wall to be breached. Olin lay in the simulation pod, the white hatch sealing him in with a soft hiss. In the control room, I stood before the main console, Taurus and the other technician at their stations. The door was sealed with a security lock that I had personally encoded with my biometrics. Loris was watching, I had no doubt, but he wouldn't be getting in easily. "Initiating cerebral sensory weave," I said, my voice steady. "Baseline brain activity is stable. Olin, can you hear me?" "Affirmative, Doctor." His voice came back, filtered through the comms. "I'm activating the primary simulation procedures now. There may be a period of disorientation." "Understood." I engaged the sequence. On the monitors, Olin's brain activity, displayed as a series of calm, orderly waves, exploded into a chaotic storm of light and color. His fight-or-flight response, dormant for generations, lit up the board like a supernova. He was in. He experienced it all at once. Gravity was a fist. The air was thick with alien scents. Hunger was a screaming command, and fear. Fear was a cold fire in his veins. A constant, thrumming awareness of massive, fast-moving shapes glimpsed through dense foliage. His new body was small, weak, prey. Instinct, a force he'd only ever read about, took over. He found a burrow and huddled inside, shaking with others. Their shared warmth was a shocking, profound revelation. Hours passed in the simulation, minutes in the real world. He learned to survive. Then came the crux of the experiment. His ancestor self, driven by a flicker of something other than hunger or fear, crawled out of the burrow and scrambled to the top of a ridge. He saw it. The twin suns crested the horizon, one a brilliant searing gold, the other a smaller, softer rose pink. They bathed the landscape in a light of breathtaking, unearthly beauty. It served no purpose, it was simply magnificent. He felt a swelling in his chest, a feeling that had no name. Pure, unadulterated awe. A sharp, blaring alarm ripped through the control room. "What is it?" I snapped. "Prefect Olin's cerebral activity is dangerously erratic," Taurus reported, his voice tight. "Exceeding all safe parameters." A loud grinding sound came from the door. A security officer was using a high-efficiency drill on the lock mechanism. Sparks flew. 10 seconds later, the lock failed with a loud crack, and the door slid open. Prefect Loris stood there, flanked by the two stone-faced officers. "His brain activity is dangerously erratic," Loris declared, his voice cold and triumphant. He strode in, eyes fixed on the chaotic brain scan display. "The simulation is flawed. I am terminating this project. Detain her." The two officers moved towards me. My mind raced. Olin was the nexus. The awe was the bridge. If they cut the connection now... "No!" I hit a command sequence, my fingers striking a specific series of keys on the console. A red light flashed on the pod's interface. Main controls locked. The officers hesitated. "He is at the most delicate stage!" I yelled, my voice ringing with a raw passion that stunned them. "You don't understand! Terminating the raw cerebral feed now will abandon him to the fire. You will burn away everything he is, leaving only the cinders of raw sensation." Loris didn't hesitate. He shoved me aside, a shockingly physical act for a Lumani. My shoulder hit the edge of the console and I stumbled back. His hand, long and pale, reached for the master override panel on the wall, a flush-mounted plate for emergency shutdowns. "A broken mind," Loris said, his fingers inches from the panel, "is preferable to a corrupted one." Just as his fingertips brushed the cool metal of the override, a loud hiss echoed through the room. We all froze. The simulation pod, its own internal safeguards detecting the stabilization of a new, coherent consciousness, had initiated a safe release sequence. The hatch slid open. Slowly, Olin sat up. He was shuddering, a series of violent, full-body tremors. He looked down at his own smooth, slender hands, as if they were alien things. He raised his head and looked at the neutral, white ceiling. And then we all saw it. A single drop of liquid welled in the corner of his eye, traced a slow, glistening path down his cheek, and fell. A tear. He slowly turned his head, his gaze sweeping past the stunned technicians, past me, and finally landing on a frozen Prefect Loris. Olin's lips parted. He whispered a single word, a sound filled with a universe of reverence, pain, and transcendent wonder. A name. Solara. It was the name of the golden sun from his ancestral sky. The first piece of poetry a Lumani had uttered in 1,000 years. The raw, undeniable, illogical emotion packed into that one word was a force of nature. It seemed to steal the air from Loris's lungs, shattering his lifetime of carefully constructed denial. His hand fell from the override panel, and he simply stared. A being of pure logic confronted by an irrefutable, confounding truth. Weeks later, the capital city of Lumar was no longer silent. The change was jarring and chaotic. Loris had been politically silenced, relegated to his quarters, a living ghost. The stillness had not been cured. It had been shattered. Olin, now the de facto leader of a burgeoning reformist movement, had used the black budget funding to establish the first ancestral immersion prototypes. They weren't yet widespread public institutions, but secret, high-demand centers of change. Data from Olin's experience had inevitably leaked onto the restricted data nets, igniting a firestorm of Latin curiosity among a populace starved for meaning. I toured one of the first centers. It was a scene of beautiful, frightening chaos. I watched as awakened Lumani emerged from pods. One, a former data archivist, sat on the floor, clumsily trying to carve a piece of scrap metal with a sharpened tool. Another, a prefect from the Transportation Guild, was humming, trying to recreate a harmony she had heard in the simulated wind. A third simply sat against a wall and wept, not with sadness, but with the overwhelming shock of a lifetime of unfelt grief being released at once. In another area, a group of Orthodox Lumani watched them with undisguised fear and disgust, their placid masks of judgment barely concealing their terror. Conflict, creativity, passion, sorrow, life. The beautiful, silent tomb was gone, and a noisy, vibrant, troubled nursery was being born in its place. The day of my departure, Olin met me at the docking bay. He was changed. New expressions, small and subtle, animated his features as he spoke. He was learning the language of the heart. "It is difficult to articulate the experience," he said, and the admission of difficulty was itself a revelation. He struggled for words. The fear. It was a cold star in my gut. A dense, heavy point of absolute certainty, but the warmth. The shared warmth in the burrow, it was like having a second sun inside my own chest. He was using a metaphor. He was building a bridge of understanding, going beyond the simple recounting of data. He was forging the first links of a new culture. "You're a poet, Olin," I said with a small smile.
He seemed to consider the word.
"Perhaps," he said. "A form of communication that sacrifices efficiency for accuracy." As I stood at the threshold of my ship's ramp, he stopped me one last time. "Doctor, a parting gift." He presented me with a small, heavy object, resting on a piece of plain cloth. It was a stone. Using the geological data from the simulation I had designed, a fabricator had rendered it, molecule by molecule. It was dark, volcanic, and utterly imperfect. Its surface was rough, with a specific, unreproducible grain of mineral flecks. A unique object in a civilization that had prized perfect replication above all else. Into its rough surface, Olin had painstakingly scratched a crude symbol, 2 overlapping circles of unequal size. The double sunrise. Solara and her smaller, rose-colored companion. It was clumsy, asymmetrical, and breathtakingly beautiful. The first piece of post-stillness Lumani art.
"So, you can feel the weight of it too,"
he said. I took the stone from him. It was heavy in my palm, its mass real and tangible. It was proof. Proof of my life's work. Proof that a soul, even one buried for millennia under mountains of cold logic, could be reclaimed. I looked from the crude, unique object in my hand to Olin's face. He was watching me, his expression one of intense focus. And then, he attempted something extraordinary. The muscles around his mouth and eyes moved in an unfamiliar, clumsy configuration. It was small and uncertain, and it was undeniably real. It was a smile. I felt my own smile answer it, full, quiet, and triumphant. I closed my hand around the stone, the weight of a reborn world resting in my palm, and boarded my ship, leaving a species on the painful, beautiful, and necessary path back to itself.